Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 6. The Great Wars, 66 through 135 of the Common Era.
The Christian church, as we have seen, began in Jerusalem. The first activities of Jesus' followers unfolded in Jerusalem, and we have some fairly circumstantial evidence about their work there for a couple of years. Our chief source, as I mentioned last time, for this kind of activity is the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles as fleshed out and filled in some points by the letters of Paul, because Paul is one of the characters on this particular stage. The apostles we saw were gathered in the upper room. They experienced the Holy Spirit and began to go onto the streets and preach the message of the crucified and risen Jesus, the Savior, Jesus the Messiah. And they attracted a certain amount of attention, and they began to attract followers. So the Jesus movement began to grow slowly. I mean, we're still talking very small numbers here, and began to attract a certain amount of attention, some from the authorities, who were not terribly pleased by the fact that this thing was still going on, the Jewish authorities. The Romans didn't seem to care a great deal about this, but also attracted attention on the part of other Jews. And one of the extraordinary events of those early years in Jerusalem is the execution, the stoning, public stoning, of one of Jesus' followers by the name of Stephen, who was preaching his message to his fellow Hellenized Jews. The Jews of Jerusalem and the followers of Jesus of Jerusalem, like them, were divided into what are called in the Acts of the Apostles the Hebrews and the Hellenes. They're all Jews. One type speaks Aramaic, has Aramaic culture. The other type are assimilated to Hellenism. But they're all Jews, and that Jesus' followers had both groups in them, and that this community of Jesus' followers in Jerusalem was made up of both types. Stephen was of the Hellenized type, was preaching to his fellow Hellenes, and was accused of blasphemy publicly and was stoned on the spot. Among those who witnessed this execution was somebody named Shaul, who turns out to have been a Jew from Tarsus, in what is today Turkey, who was in Jerusalem on a kind of study fellowship. He was a Pharisee. He was a deeply convinced Jew who loathed the Christians and loathed what he was hearing. And he witnessed the death of Stephen, of which he probably approved, and set off for Damascus, as the story goes, to pursue Christians there. Under what warrant, we don't know. But it was on the road to Damascus that Shaul had his famous experience of conversion. He was visited by Jesus in person and was converted. His name was changed to Paul, and he became one of the greatest and most convincing of the members of the new, still aborning Jesus movement. Paul spends most of his career out in what is called the diaspora. The diaspora refers collectively to those Jews living outside Eretz Israel, and they were a great number of them. There were more outside than there were inside at this stage. There were large Jewish populations in most of the great cities around the eastern Mediterranean, and even as far west as Rome and Spain. Throughout the Roman Empire, there were colonies of Jews who had settled in, almost all of them in cities. They were not agriculturalists. They tended to be city dwellers. And so Paul's spreading of the good news of Jesus tended to be out there in that diaspora. But he is connected with Jerusalem once or twice, and they're rather interesting sort of experiences. One is he is summoned back. He is being very successful in these Jewish communities. Many people are becoming followers of Jesus the Messiah. These are all still Jews, but many of them are also Gentiles. These are people who are on the fringes of the Jewish community who have heard the story and are convinced. And Paul initiates them into this community of believers. The process is called baptism. And without their having to become Jews first, which becomes an issue. How can you be a follower of Jesus the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, without being a Jew yourself? Paul said, of course you can. The people in Jerusalem were not so sure. They summoned Paul back, and we get a view of the church acting in a kind of authority role. This community, the mother church, the home church of the Christian movement, summons Paul to explain himself. And this assembly is headed, surprisingly to us, not by Peter, whom we might expect from the Gospels, but from James, the brother of the Lord, Jesus' relative, perhaps even his blood brother, who is in charge of this Christian community. And they ask Paul what he's about, what's up with the Gentiles out there. And Paul explains what is happening, that the Gentiles are being attracted. This is part of the ingathering of the Gentiles promised by the Messianic era, that's expected in the Messianic era. And it was now happening. And so there was a kind of compromise was worked out. Paul conceded a little bit, they conceded a little bit, and Paul went off back to his mission out in the diaspora and paid no attention to the compromise, just continued doing what he was doing before. But before he went out, Paul also visited the temple in Jerusalem, where typically Paul got in trouble. But Paul's middle name was Trouble in many ways, and he used to boast how many times he got in trouble out in the diaspora, that synagogue authorities were constantly leaning on Paul. They didn't like what they were hearing somehow. Something struck them as very wrong about Paul's message. Anyway, the story that circulated in the temple, which was a hotbed of rumor, is that he had brought a Gentile into the temple, and Paul was in deep trouble, and if the Roman troops had not come down the steps from the fortress Antonia and taken Paul into custody, he might have been killed there on the spot. And so Paul was arrested. The garrison commander discovered that Paul was a Roman citizen, which surprises us as well. And so Paul had to be tried as a Roman citizen, was sent to the governor of the province. And Paul, as a Roman citizen, could appeal his case to the emperor, which he did. And so he is sent off to Rome. And that's the last we hear of him. That's where the Acts of the Apostle ends. Paul is in Rome, awaiting trial. But meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, almost the last thing we hear is that James, who shows up in Josephus as a very observant Jew, James, the brother of the Lord, is also killed by a Jewish mob, also stoned, presumably for his blasphemies. It's a kind of curious event, and we're not sure exactly what happened. But James, too, is killed. As I say, this is in the year 62 and of the Common Era. And 4 years later, there breaks out one of the most tragic and important events in all of Jewish history, namely the great insurrection of the Jews against Rome, the war that follows, and the consequences that follow the war. Now, we know a lot about this because we have the works of Josephus, as I've mentioned earlier. We have his Jewish Antiquities, which is a kind of general survey of the history of the Jews, in a way guaranteed. It's written for a Gentile audience, and so it's to give the Gentile audience, to convince them that the Jews are not such bad people after all, and that their religion is not all that superstitious or irrational. But he also wrote a work called The Great Jewish War, the Great Roman Jewish War, and it describes these events that we're talking about now, the events of 66 to 70 of the Common Era, this great insurrection against Rome. And Josephus is more than an eyewitness. He is a participant in this. He begins as a Jewish general in Galilee with the forces of the insurrection, and ends up as after having lost patience with the cause and thinking it suicidal and stupid and ill-advised, goes over to the Romans and spends the rest of his life in Rome, where 20 years or so after the war, he writes his history of this event. So we have a good deal of information about this, all of it literary, and almost all of it from Josephus, whose sympathies are with the Roman side. He is not a great admirer of the zealots who provoked this insurrection, because he thinks, as I say, it was suicidal. Anyway, the center of the war, as far as we're concerned, is really Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the subject of a very, very long siege. And the Romans put it under close siege. They hem it round. They station legions there. There's an interesting kind of thesis that has been developed about this war. According to this way of thinking, when the Romans were confronted with some kind of insurrection, of which this would be an example, they didn't respond to all of them. There were always little brush fires all over the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire just selected what it wanted to make an example of, selected which brush fire it would douse, and then brought an enormous hook and ladder company and doused it so there'd be no mistake about it. I'd poured tons and tons of water on it. And this may have been the case here, that the Romans may have been making this a kind of example of what would happen if people revolted against the Roman authority, which they did. And the causes were multiple, as we can sort of figure out from Josephus. The Romans were not particularly patient governors of these people. Romans were great guardians of what they considered political order, and they were willing to cut you lots of slack as long as you didn't disturb the political order, but they maintained the order. And in the case of the Jews, it was a very, very tough kind of situation. It was a difficult place to govern, somewhat the way that, say, modern Romans feel about Sicily, for example. It's just things are going on there that the Romans are not really aware of, don't want to know too much about, and really would prefer to think about in some other way. That's the way the ancient Romans thought about Judea, I think. And they were also sort of stiff-necked about it, and the Jews were stiff-necked in turn. And the Romans weren't always sensible to the tender points of the Jewish psyche on their religious issues, and the Jews were not willing to cut the Romans much slack either. So that this was heading for a collision that was almost inevitable. And Romans were not used to sort of making accommodations with their subjects. So this war, bang, exploded, and it exploded in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the last sort of major holdout, obviously, and inside of Jerusalem, the last major holdout inside the city was the temple. The temple area was the most secure, and that's where the war came to an end. The war dragged on after the fall of Jerusalem, by the way. The war dragged on for a while because there was Masada. Masada is this famous mesa out close to the Dead Sea, where Jewish zealots held out for a very long time. And the Romans, this is a good example of the Romans casting a lot of water on brush fires. The Romans could have just sat there and besieged the place and just starved them out. They had no way of really escaping these Jewish holdouts up there. The Romans didn't do that. They built a ramp up to the top of this mesa. And they were going to drive their SUVs all the way to the top and crush the Jews there. And the Jews on top of the Masada could see, the ramp approaching. And they held up to the very end, and many of them committed suicide at the very end. The whole thing was perhaps suicidal. And it's interesting that the modern state of Israel has made out of Masada a kind of shrine, testimony to the bravery and the courage of these Jewish insurrectionists, while Josephus, a contemporary looking upon the same thing, just thought it was a form of suicide. Right? That there was no way they could win. There was no way they could achieve their political ends. Anyway, to get back to Jerusalem, the city is invested, and then as the Romans break into the city, the last holdouts are holed up inside the temple in Jerusalem. And we're given, as I say, from Josephus, we're given very circumstantial descriptions of what's going on there. And that as the temple is being invested and the fighting is going on, this is like the last siege of Berlin. It is that kind of thing. It is street by street fighting, and large parts of the city are set on fire and destroyed. And the holdouts in the temple are still fighting, but the temple catches fire. And Josephus, who describes all of this, and who is almost our only source on it, makes it appear as if it's an accident, and that the Roman general, whose name is Titus, when he hears this, is very distraught because he didn't want it to happen, and He rushes in all sorts of reinforcements to try to get the fire under control, and he can't, and the fire burns out of control and destroys the temple, and with it, as the final resistance collapses. Just a little side note on Titus. This war, the original general in this war, his name was Vespasian, and early on in the war, he became Roman emperor. He went to Rome, became the emperor, and eventually Titus himself became a Roman emperor. So this war produced in two of its generals rulers of the Roman Empire, Vespasian and Titus. And it was Titus who, at the end of the war, erected this triumphal arch in Rome, which still exists there today, and you can see on the arch this triumph that is celebrated by Titus, and you can see up on the arch carrying the spoils of Jerusalem, the Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of Jerusalem, including a very large menorah. And this is on the Arch of Titus in Rome to celebrate this victory. But to get back to Jerusalem, the temple, there was burning in the temple. Now, these stone buildings really can't burn down, right? What happens normally to buildings in the ancient world is that the roof burns, and that because the roofs are timber, generally speaking, and they burn, and the gold and silver and things can melt down on the walls. The furnishings can obviously burn. But what happens is, with an ancient building, if the roof burns, that eventually the rains and the elements will destroy the rest of the building. But when this war is over, when it's all finished, Titus orders the city to be, a lot of it has been burned, orders the city to be demolished, so that it's deliberately taken down. It must have been a great labor to do this, because the temple in particular must have been strongly constructed, and so destroying the temple, overthrowing the walls, right, must have been a considerable labor. And presumably what happened was that the temple, the buildings of the temple, the stones of the temple, were either left there on top as rubble or else cast over the sides, because this is a temple platform, and in some places it's 2 or 3 stories above ground level, and so that the debris was just thrown over the sides of this thing into the ground below, and eventually became part of the building materials and the covered with earth that just began to sink down. The level of the ground level rose up. So this temple has disappeared. What Titus said, according to Josephus, is that what he wanted to do, the only thing he ordered that should be left in the city of Jerusalem should be Herod's towers on the west side by the western gate, the Jaffa Gate, to show, according to Titus, how great a city it was that he conquered and how powerful this thing was. So he allowed those towers to stand, and as a matter of fact, that's the chief relic, the chief remaining part of Herodian Jerusalem. There are traces of one of Herod's towers on the western side of the city, just inside the Jaffa Gate. The towers, by the way, had names. Herod named his towers, which is a curious little piece of business. At any rate, there it is. The temple now is gone. The temple has been removed, and the city is destroyed for all practical purposes. The population lives among the ruins as best they can. What is interesting here is that a number of people escaped, interestingly. Obviously, all sorts of people cleared out as the Romans, anybody who wanted to save his or her life and was not devoted to the cause got out of there. But 2 sets of refugees are worth noting. One group got out before the outbreak of the war, and these were the Christians, this little community of the followers of Jesus, the Messiah, the Jesus movement, we can call it, got out before the final debacle in Jerusalem. So maybe sometime before 66, maybe with the death of James, who knows. And they went to the other side of the Jordan, to a place called Pella, which is a very Gentile city. It's a Greek city on the other side, in what is today the Kingdom of Jordan, and located themselves there. They eventually returned, but they got out before this debacle. The other group that got out were the Pharisees, and in the person of the leader of the Pharisees, whose name was Yochanan ben Zakkai. There's a famous story of that during the siege, Ben Zakkai put himself in a coffin and had his followers smuggle him out as a corpse. Jerusalem is a sacred place, and so according to Jewish law, corpses cannot stay in the city overnight. They have to be removed immediately and buried outside. And so they said, we have a corpse here according to our law, and the Roman sentries said, yeah, and they carried him out. And so Yochanan ben Zakkai, the head of the Pharisaic movement, lived for another day. The movement relocated eventually, after a couple of preliminary moves, eventually settled down into Galilee, where it reconstituted itself. And the Pharisees are, at the end of it, when all this dust clears, it's the Pharisees who are the leading figures in the revival of Judaism. They are the surviving party. They are the surviving members. They are the important ones. They are the future of the Jewish community as a religious community, as a community of believers. Politically, there's not much else on the horizon. But as it turns out, there was something else on the horizon. Unbelievably, there was another insurrection that was still left inside the energy of the Jewish people. And this took place, we don't know, this period, Josephus ends his history with the end of the war. And so we're really we don't have a lot to go on about the history of the Jews after 70. And between 70 and 130, those 60 years, we know practically nothing about the Jews or about Jerusalem, except to note that in 132, thereabouts, there is another insurrection, and the Jews of Judea revolt once more against the Roman authority. And the emperor now is the Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian, it's interesting, Hadrian has a reputation. Roman emperors, like all other rulers, are divided into good guys and bad guys, just like American presidents and kings of England. There are good ones, there are bad ones. On a scale of 1 to 10, who are the ones, who are the tens? Well, Hadrian gets a 9 or a 10. Hadrian is like one of the good Roman emperors. And he is an enlightened and prodigious builder. And he had plans. He made a tour of the Middle East in 117 of the Common Era. All these dates, by the way, from now on are all dates of the Common Era. There's no more. We've left BCE and we're now into CE or AD. And so Hadrian was a builder, and it was under him that this revolt took place. And we're not quite sure how this thing worked. One theory is that Hadrian, who ended up rebuilding Jerusalem, may have conceived of his plans for rebuilding the city during this tour, and it became known to the Jews and that he was going to turn this into another Gentile enclave like Caesarea by the sea, and that this is what provoked them into this kind of open revolt. Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, there was a revolt, and the other clue about it is the man who was leading the revolt. We had to piece this together really very circumspectly from scattered references in the Roman historical sources who don't pay a lot of attention to this. And there's a little bit of archaeological evidence from this, but this is not an easy task, right, to do. Anyway, the Jewish leader of this second revolt is a man by the name of Bar Kokhba, originally Bar Kosiba, but given the messianic title of the son of the star of Bar Kokhba, because he apparently, we're on, the ice is a little bit thin under us, he apparently claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be a messianic figure, although we don't know much about the content of his message. And, more than that, he was recognized as the Messiah by the chief rabbi of the times, a man famous in Jewish religious history, named Rabbi Akiba. And Rabbi Akiba accepted, as far as we can tell, the claims of Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah. Now, again, the implications of this we simply do not know. We're pretty sure that the forces of Bar Kokhba took Jerusalem away from the control of the Romans. This is still now a Roman province. This is the Roman province of Judea. It has been a Roman province since the year 6 CE, and we're now in the year 132, 133, so it's been a Roman province for a long time. And Romans have controlled this area, and not only they have controlled this, all the Herods have disappeared at this stage. the Romans controlled the entire Middle East. It's all part of their holdings. It's their empire. And here is this upstart, Bar Kokhba, and his forces seizing Jerusalem from the Romans. And in the course of this, the Romans react again, as they necessarily must. And we don't have a lot of details about this war. They take Jerusalem one more time and get rid of Bar Kokhba and his forces, and that's the end of that. The end of this insurrection, which lasts maybe 2 or 3 years, 132, 135. It's the consequences of this war, which are rather interesting for the city of Jerusalem, right? That's what we're interested in. That, first of all, the Romans have had enough of this, right? There have been other insurrections, by the way, in other places around the Mediterranean, right? Jews in other places. Jews in what is today Libya had a major insurrection a number of years earlier. We don't know if these things were connected or not. Jewish communities tended to stay in communication with each other, but we don't know the intimate connections here. At any rate, there were Jewish insurrections going on, and now the reaction is rather strong. In this case, the Jews are banned from living in Judea, which includes Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital. So from now on, this is 135, for the next 500 years, there are no Jews to be found in Judea. They are banned there by Roman law. Now, in the middle of this period, this 500 years that we're talking about, that Roman Empire becomes the Christian Roman Empire. And the Christians don't change the law. They don't change the ban. It just stays in effect. Right? The Christians didn't put it into place. It was put in by Hadrian's generation, but it stayed there. It wasn't removed. So this ban, plus a special tax, was put on the Jews. They were taxed as Jews. And so this is the situation with the Jews. No Jews in Judea or in Jerusalem. Now, what is interesting is that during the course of this period, we're given occasional reports of pilgrims, for example, Christians who were up there on the Temple Mount, reporting seeing Jews there, right? And in very small groups, and so looking straggly and crestfallen and dispirited, as of course a Christian would depict a Jew at this stage. But the story was that these people had to bribe themselves up onto the Temple Mount, and they used to go there maybe once a year on the 9th of Av to celebrate the destruction of the temple, 9th of the month of Av, to celebrate the destruction of the temple, to lament it, and there they were, sort of pitiful creatures, say these Christians who saw them. So that's the extent of Jewish presence in this place. But Hadrian had his way. Hadrian redid the city of Jerusalem. He rebuilt it. First of all, he renamed it, naturally. Right? That's one of the great perks of being the emperor. You get to name your own cities, as we'll see, as Alexander did, calling them naturally after himself, Alexandria, as Constantine will do later, calling his Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Hadrian, there was a city in Egypt which he named Antinopolis. He named it after his boyfriend. But the city of Jerusalem he named with a little more dignity, perhaps. He called it Aelia Capitolina, right? Alias being the family name of Hadrian's family name, and Capitolina named after Zeus Capitoline, or his favorite deity at Rome. Capitoline is one of the hills of Rome, and so Zeus Capitolinus is the Zeus who is worshipped on the Capitoline. So Aelia Capitolina is the new name for Jerusalem. And it is called that for a considerable amount of time. It replaces it in many quarters as the name of Jerusalem. But he also redid the city. And we have some literary descriptions of it, but we also have a map of the city of Jerusalem, this famous mosaic map, which I will return to later, found in the church in a place called Madaba in Jordan. It shows the city as it was in the year 570 of the Common Era. But it shows us a little bit about the layout of Hadrian's city, and what it shows us is Romans had a major artery around the center of a city, and then they imposed a kind of grid plan of cross streets. So if you can imagine, say, Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue in New York City as one of the major artery, that's called the Cardo or the Hinge Street. And that in Aelia Capitolina there was a hinge, a Cardo, that ran north-south from the Damascus Gate out the southern end. It is as much of a straight line as the topography allowed. And it was, in the modern Roman style, a colonnaded street. That is to say, there were covered colonnades on either side. Either sidewalk was covered with columns, and the main street was, like all Roman main streets, the width of two carts, right, abreast, so that wheel traffic could pass each other going in opposite directions. That was the standard width of a major Roman street. Now, later on, one of the curious things is wheeled vehicles disappear from the Middle East, replaced by animals. And so streets become very different. They don't need to be twice the width of a wheeled cart. They just had to be once the width of an animal packed with goods on either side of it, with saddlebags, let's say. Anyway, to get back to the street, there is Aelia Capitolina with its main colonnaded street running south directly out of the Damascus Gate, and then down toward the temple there's another street, another colonnaded street that goes left from the Damascus Gate down into the valley, runs along the Temple Mount, and then out the southern end as well. And then there are other buildings in the city that Hadrian did. He built a new forum. The walls of the city, by the way, are now broader. They cover more territory than they did in Herod's day. And particularly in the northwest corner of the city, it is all now within walls, places that have been open in Herod's day. I mention this because one of the places that was now within the walls, that was outside the walls when Herod built his walls, is the place of Jesus' burial. So the burial place of Jesus, which was outside of Herod's walls, are now inside the walls of Hadrian's city. And as a matter of fact, Hadrian builds a new forum, which is like the equivalent of, say, a mall. It's an open space with religious and commercial and administrative buildings around it. And there is a forum off the main street which covers, as a matter of fact, the place where Jesus was crucified and was buried. Right? So the Hadrianic Forum is, as it turns out, is going to cover that place. So this is a brand spanking new city, totally pagan. Right? He's removed. The Temple Mount is just a quiet little blotch there. There's no temple. And there are no Jews. This is a pagan city built by a pagan emperor with a pagan name, and bright and fancy and new.
After listening to Lecture 6, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. How do we know about the Christians in the Holy Land at this time? Now let's listen to Professor Peters' response.
Yes, that's interesting and important. Our authority on this is the church historian Eusebius, about whom we'll be seeing a lot more, who was Constantine's biographer. So he dies sometime about 340. And what he tells us is that there were Christians. The Christians got out before the Great War of 66-70, but they returned. And apparently, although he doesn't mention this specifically, apparently they continued in Jerusalem all the way up to this second insurrection. Now, Eusebius doesn't say what happens to them in the second insurrection, but he then says something which is quite interesting. He says there were 15 bishops. By bishop he means heads of this Jerusalem church, up to the time of this siege, of the second insurrection. And, says he, they were all Hebrews. That is to say, all the heads of the Jerusalem Christian community were Jewish Christians. And that after the war, after this insurrection, from then on, the bishops of the Jerusalem Christian community are all Gentiles. That is to say, they're non-Jewish. The word Gentile simply means a non-Jew. It comes from the Latin gens, which is a translation of the Greek word ethnos, which means simply people, nation, tribe. and it's a generic term that's used by the Jews. It means the Goyim, the non-Jew is simply what it means.
This ends Lecture 6. This ends Lecture 6. This ends Lecture 6. This ends Lecture 6.